welcome back. I am so glad that you're here. Please give yourself a few seconds. Really invite you to not skip through this part, not speed it up. You're probably busy all day, have 1,000 things fighting for your attention. Just give yourself a couple of seconds. Hi. Welcome back to Evolution. We're going to continue our discussion of the Tree of Life. Now that you are pretty familiar with phylogenies, we're going to dig a little deeper into some more terminology a little bit, and then we're also going to talk about how the tree is used to understand evolutionary concepts, evolutionary relationships, really. So this is the second installment of the Tree of Life conversation. First, here's just an example. We've been talking about lots of different trees. This is Darwin's finches. And Darwin's finches, I mentioned before, is a famous example, and we're going to come back to this in the last part of this group of lectures. This is a radiation, an adaptive radiation. And so this is just to kind of give you a little preview. Here's an example of an evolutionary tree, and this is Darwin's finches. Okay, a couple of little extensions on things that we've already talked about in previous lectures and that you worked on and hopefully solidified an understanding of in the Phylogenies as Models website that you went to and played with and answered some questions about. So when we're looking at a tree, I've numbered the common ancestors on this tree. The most recent common ancestor of B and D. Let's just go back and review. Looking at this tree based on what you've learned, who is the most recent common ancestor of B and D? And then ask yourself, is B more closely related to C or to D? So first question, we're asking the most recent common ancestor of B, that's here, and D. And so what we need to do is we need to trace, here's D's lineage. Well, 3 can't be the most recent common ancestor because 3 isn't a common ancestor of B. So we have to keep going back all the way to 2. Now let's see, what about B? We trace B back to 2. So the most recent common ancestor of B and D is 2. The next question is B more closely related to C or to D? Well, let me erase that. Let's take those off of there. Put this back, so that's 2. And then we want to know, is B more closely related to C or D? And this is another one of those things where hopefully you picked up on this really quickly about we tend to want to just visually associate. We kind of want to say, oh, well, of course, B is more closely related to C because C is physically closer. But remember that this node can rotate. We're seeing this in this association now, but it could just as easily and just as accurately look like this. So hopefully what you thought, I don't know with that blue if you can see that very well, hopefully what you thought when you saw that question was, well, we don't know. We can't tell. We don't know if B is more closely related to C or D based on this tree. parent. So hopefully you can see. So both of these trees are equally correct. All right. Those are kind of reviewing some concepts that we talked about. Another thing that I would like to talk about, I think it's on this slide, was where I wanted to put this. Just one second. Okay, so going back to this slide without any notations on it, there are a couple of things that we're going to go back to now that we kind of have an understanding of the basic structure of a phylogenetic tree. We talked about that any group that includes a common ancestor and all of its descendants, we call this a monophyletic group. We also call this a clade. So this entire thing is a clade. And what we have in the tree is a structure where clades are nested within clades. So this sort of yellow color that I've used to outline this clade, that outlines one clade. But within this clade, there's another clade. So this is an ancestor and all of its descendants. So this is another clade. So if we called the green clade clade 2 and we called the yellow clade clade 1, we would say that clade 2 is nested within clade 1. These are nested clades. So it's kind of like those Russian nesting dolls, where you have a smaller doll inside a slightly larger doll, inside a slightly larger doll. And if we continued zooming out on this phylogeny, including more and more groups and more branches going further and further back to common ancestors, we would have more and more nested clades. So that's some terminology. And then, let's see, do I want to do it here? Yeah, I'll do it here. We already talked about that. That's not what I want to talk about. Okay. Then another concept. I haven't figured out how to erase when I'm actively in. So we'll go here and to talk about the concept of sister taxa. So these two C and D that are branching from the same common ancestor and directly next to each other from this node. So we couldn't rotate this node and change their relationship. These are sister taxa. So these could be species, these could be genera, these could be families. So sister genera, sister species, sister families. When they're right next to each other like this, these are called sister taxa. And so we have nested clades, the idea that a clade can be nested within another clade, the idea of sister taxa. And then finally, we have the idea of rooting. A tree, this right here, is the root of this tree, where it starts from. And this particular tree is rooted at the lineage that gives rise to the common ancestor 1. And of course, if we quote unquote zoomed out and included more clades, then we would have a different root to this tree. So this, for this tree, is the root of this tree. All right. Another important thing to understand when we're visually looking at a tree is that similarity of organisms does not equal closeness of relationship. So similarity in form does not necessarily equal, I'll say closeness of relationship. couple of examples. If we look at the body form of dolphins and sharks, it seems like just looking at them visually, they're visually very similar, that they would be more closely related to each other. But you know this, dolphins and sharks are well, I shouldn't say very, are somewhat distantly related. So sharks are fish, dolphins are mammals. Dolphins are much more closely related to hippopotamus than they are to a shark. Another example of this is one of my very favorites. I've talked about, you've probably heard this before, that birds, if we're going to call reptiles an actual thing in evolution, that birds have to be included for that to be a monophyletic group. Birds are more closely related to crocodiles than they are to any of the other reptiles. So we kind of want to think, okay, if birds are reptiles, maybe they're really closely related to lizards. Nope, closely related to crocodiles. How cool is that? And just a little aside, baby crocodiles chirp. I don't know if that's an ancestral trait or not, but when they hatch and they're calling for their mom, they actually make these cool little chirping sounds. And I have a colleague who was consulting with some medical researchers, and they were interested in figuring out something about the human heart, and I don't actually know what it was that they were seeking to figure out. Make myself a little bigger since I'm just yapping right now. So they were trying to figure out what's going on with this thing, I don't know what it was, in the human heart, and he was consulting with them as an evolutionary biologist, and they were using a bird as a model for this, whatever it was. And they were trying to figure out, going quote unquote back to the ancestral state. What is the ancestral state of this structure in the heart that we're interested in? And they kept using different lizards as their model to try to figure out the ancestral state. And he said, oh, well, why don't you use crocodiles? And they all said, what? Why would we use crocodiles? And he said, well, because crocodiles are more closely related to birds than they are to lizards. And if a bird is your model species, then you should probably, if you're looking for the next closest relative, you should use a crocodile. And they were all minds blown. What? They went and they did their research in crocodile hearts, and they found exactly what it was that they were looking for. And this is just one of those ways where, many ways, where an understanding of evolutionary history informs everything in science. Okay, I'm going to shrink. Ooh, just kidding. I'm going to shrink me back down now. There I go. All right. Another one is that we have some primates that are little, even named after squirrels, like a squirrel monkey, and they move like squirrels, and we think that they should be related to squirrels, but of course it's a primate more closely related to chimpanzees than it is to squirrels. Okay, we talked about this already before. Gonna review this concept that a tree, an evolutionary tree, a phylogenetic tree, can be shaped a whole lot of different ways. And as we're moving through the book uses several different shapes of trees. I'm going to try to stick with the rectangular format, but the book doesn't always do that. So this tree, if we look here, is exactly equivalent to that tree. It's also exactly equivalent to this tree. So all we did was flip these and that to get, let's make this tree number 1, 2, 3. So to get tree number 3, all we did was flip these two sides, 1 and 2 and 3. Also equivalent is this tree. I think it's much easier if you mentally convert tree number 4 to the structure, the shape of tree number 2. If these angled trees make sense to you, cool, that's fine. but I really strongly suggest that you work through, like maybe pause the video or come back to this slide and work through converting these, I can't remember what these trees are called, the name, but these angle trees to the rectangular format. Okay, this one, tree 5, is exactly the same. These are all the same. All we did here was we just took tree 2 and we went, whoop, let's turn it on its side. Same thing. Then same thing here, 6, exactly the same tree. Again, we've just rotated which species, 1, 2, or 3, is at which tips. And once again, what I would do if this is not making sense to you is convert this to the rectangular format. Maybe what I'll do is I'll make a video and we'll convert several trees to the different formats. Same thing. So this is just showing you that in all of these cases, these trees, every single one of them is showing you the exact same thing. So those are sort of our digging a little bit deeper into the tree. And so now we're going to get into how do we actually figure out what goes where. So I mentioned in a previous video that we unfortunately, our species don't have barcodes on their foreheads. They don't carry a note that says, oh, my sister taxa is this, or I'm in this clade. So how do we infer phylogenies? How do we figure that out? We're going to talk about this in a lot more depth at the end of the semester, so this is just kind of a preview. There are a lot of evolutionary concepts that we need to understand a little bit more deeply to really dig into this, but we're going to give kind of a preview of how we figure this out. So every organism has things that are called in evolution and in phylogenetic terminology, characters. So for example, the number of toes on a forelimb, you like my bearded dragon drawing? I'm really proud of it. The number of toes on a forelimb is a character. This bearded dragon has 5 toes. So our beardy has 5 toes. A rhinoceros, however, has 3 toes on its forelimb. A horse, only 1. These are adaptations, and we'll talk about the homology of these later. This difference in number of toes is what we call a character state. All these different character states in what we call morphology. So the physical characteristics, often called morphology. Another way we can kind of think about this is the phenotype, if that's familiar. I hope that's a familiar word. Genotype leads to phenotype. So these are the physical characteristics, character states. We can take 5 toes versus 3 toes versus 1 toe. That's one character, 3 different character states. Take that in combination with hundreds of other characters and create a phylogeny. A really important concept when we're thinking about characters and character states, and a wildly important concept that I've mentioned before in evolution, is the concept of homology. To define homology, looking at each of these structures, and we've seen this image before. We have a seal, and if we look at sort of the end of the limb of the seal, we can see that each of these bones are the same, believe it or not, as those in the horse, as those in the human, as those in a pterosaur, as those in a bird, as those in a bat. Same bones, but in each of these species, that original structure, which we can deduce what an early tetrapod probably looked like based on its descendants, each of these bones, the arrangement of these bones, has been changed, adapted for what that species, what served that species best. And this is true. We have the radius here. Oh, I should change my color. I don't have that color. Here. Here's the radius. Here's the radius. You can see, hopefully, with the colors. The same bones. Isn't that so cool? I hope you guys think that that's so cool. So what the heck? All right, cool. Whatever, Jody. Or Dr. Wiggins. Whatever. It's very cool. Homology. So what this means, homology, is similarity in structure due to common descent. This is critical, due to common descent. So they have a common ancestor, and that's why these structures are very, very similar, is because of common ancestry. We'll talk later about how we can have similar structures not due to common ancestry. Okay, so we started when we were first figuring out evolutionary relationships with morphology, with these physical characteristics, which is still really important and still definitely used. But as you can imagine, as we started to sequence genomes, that massive amount of information contributed an extraordinary amount of data, because each and every position in the genome is its own freaking character state. Every single position. Whoa. The genome, like morphology, has areas of homology, areas that are the same due to common descent. If we look at this made-up sequence, we can see that this entire section is exactly the same. This section is exactly the same. So these areas that are the same due to common descent allow us this massive amount of information to figure out what the heck, where do we put these organisms on our phylogenetic tree. Checking my time here. Oh, we're at 23 minutes. Okay. We will pick up here where, all right, cool. How do we use that to figure out a phylogeny?